Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to that Christian Nerd channel. Today I'm going to be interviewing a scholar, someone that you guys actually know if you've seen other live streams that I have done, to talk about his understanding of the differing levels of thought that we see throughout the Hebrew Bible. But first, I want to make a couple of announcements and things like that. In 2 days, I have another live stream that I'm going to do. Hopefully, all the technology and everything like that works for this, but I will be streaming my reaction to a fan made animation between two of my favorite anime characters of all time, that being Goku and Saitama. If you don't know, we are big nerds at that Christian Nerd channel. And so we're interested in anime, among other things. And so if that is something that interests you, feel free to check that out on the 24th. Continuing on from there, I have some more Christian content coming out this month. We're going to be looking at the final video, um, talking about, or excuse me, the final video of a series that I did where me and a Orthodox Christian reacted to claims that were made by Catholics, or by a particular Catholic. We're gonna do all of that. That should be coming out either this week or next week. And then finally, I interviewed, this is a while ago now, but I interviewed a TikToker on her journey of deconstructing from Christianity. And that video has finally, after all this time, been edited and will be premiering on that Christianer YouTube channel towards the end of the month. I have another video coming up that's a little bit of a secret, but it's going to be a analysis of a TV show and how the theme of the TV show relates to Christian theology and practice and ethics and so on. And after all of that, throughout the rest of January, we're going to get into February with some Black History Month content. And I am very excited for that. I have a lot of really cool plans for that. I have some stuff that I'm trying to do, both in my practical life here on campus as well as for content. So I can't wait to talk about those things. Now that all of the announcements are out of the way, let me go ahead and bring on my guest. How you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. So if anyone doesn't know you, tell us who you are and the kind of work that you do.
Sure. Hi, I'm Brendan Graham Dempsey. I'm the director of research at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, and where I study worldviews and meaning-making systems, faith development, and developmental models in particular as approaches to those topics. What else? I also run Sky Meadow Institute, which is a kind of knowledge think tank institute based out of Sky Meadow Retreat, which is a retreat center that I run here in Vermont. And beyond that, I also do a lot of work, or I should say, kind of what all that work is a part of is sort of under the broad umbrella of metamodern and integrative developments in culture these days. So I do a lot of work around metamodernism, metamodern spirituality, metamodern Christianity, etc. Have a podcast, Metamodern Meaning. So that's a little kind of glimpse of me and the stuff I get up to.
Yeah, if anyone is interested in learning more about the metamodern, I have a live stream that I did with you a while back now, where we talked about and introduced metamodern Christianity. It was, for me, a very fascinating stream, and continuing to uh, think about the culture that we're in right now, that being a meta modern culture and what all that means, has continued to be very enlightening for me. And so it might be helpful for you as well. That said, we are here to talk about a recent article that you published. Go ahead and give us a introduction to that article and what you're trying to do there.
Sure. So, yeah, my background in college was in biblical studies and Christian history, and I got really into studying biblical composition history and source criticism, which I thought was just really fascinating. The more I dove into that, so that was when I encountered the documentary hypothesis, so called, which is a scholarly theory about the origins of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the theory states that those works are not a sort of singular texts, but actually an amalgamation or a weaving together of multiple strands of texts, different sources that were written at different times and come from different places and sometimes have different perspectives on the same content. And at some point, they were all kind of woven together into a relatively seamless narrative. That just blew my mind when I discovered it. I think I read Richard Elliott Friedman's book, Who Wrote the Bible, which is sort of a adventure tale version of that theory.
Mm.
Not all of which necessarily holds up so well today, but he did pioneering work on this theory for a long time. And what I do in this paper is explore that hypothesis from some quantitative analysis. And the form of quantitative analysis I use is something called lexical scoring, which is a way of capturing or measuring the hierarchical complexity of a text. And I'll unpack all this in any degree of detail that you'd like. But the basic idea is that if people are familiar with the cognitive developmental theories of Jean Piaget, very influential thinker in the 20th century around our psychological models of, you know, how our ideas about things grow more complex and sophisticated. Hierarchical complexity sort of emerges out of that tradition. It's a more fine-grained, refined approach from neo-Piagetian thinkers that kind of take his basic insights, but really kind of improve them and refine them. And that was ultimately operationalized with lexical scoring, the work of Dr. Theo Dawson, who was able to basically create an automated way to measure the hierarchical complexity of a text. And so what that then allows you to do is sort of relate texts to sort of the general cognitive developmental complexity that goes back to Piagetian frames. And the theory was something like this. Well, you know, if indeed the
Oh, hold
Pentateuch
on.
can be
You're
sort of
lagging a little
decomposed
bit.
into these different, can you hear me?
Yeah, okay, you're
Oh,
good now. Go ahead.
can you hear me now? Okay, cool. Yeah, so the theory was like, what would happen if you analyzed each of those strands individually for their complexity? And then would you see any kind of meaningful distinctions between them? So that's what this paper does, basically. And I went through the Pentateuch and I kind of broke it up into its various parts that, you know, these scholars have universally agreed upon for, you know, well, actually over a century now. And just focused on those parts. Didn't look at parts where things were contested or was overly complicated, and then got lexical scores for that. And yeah, what I was able to show was that actually these different strands do have unique complexity profiles, and more than that, that the differences in their complexity levels map to the kind of worldview frames of the different sources themselves. And so anyway, yeah, that's kind of the basic setup, and I'm happy to explain more of that if you'd like me to unpack that a bit, or anything else.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So would it be accurate to say that you were able to basically put a score on how complicated the thinking or the concepts of these different sources that make up the Pentateuch have as the sources, you know, emerge and stuff like that?
Yeah, basically, that's a good way of putting it. And for example, so to go into some of the details a little bit, the kind of classic distinctions of the documentary hypothesis have posited 4 major sources. There's the Yahwist source, or J. There's the Elohist source, E. There's the priestly source, which is called P. And then there's the Deuteronomist source, which is D. So JEDP. And what's interesting is that the D and the P sources have been thought to basically come from scribal contexts. You know, P is called priestly because most of what it's talking about is things that concern the priests and the temple and all these kinds of things. And similarly with sort of Deuteronomy, it was thought to come from the late 7th century BC during, you know, probably around the era of the reign of King Josiah. And at both of these points, you've got a developed bureaucracy and a scribal elite that, are doing these kinds of things. Whereas J and E are much more sort of oral folktale like. These are the stories of the patriarchs and Jacob and Abraham and Isaac. And they're in a kind of very different conceptual register. And so those are kind of simpler. And whereas the D and P sources read more kind of intricate and complex. And so, yeah, this basically was able to quantify that to some degree. That indeed, when you actually look at the complexity of the semantics of the language itself, in translation, I should emphasize though, you are seeing a noticeable difference in the different complexity levels of these sources.
Gotcha. So you've talked about this already, but biblical scholars have talked about different sources in the first five books of the Bible. You've talked about and kind of introduced the idea of sources to us. However, we know some Christians worry that this kind of theory, source criticism, undermines what they consider to be the authority and inspiration of Scripture. And so, in light of your findings, how would you respond to that concern?
Yeah, well, I'm very sympathetic to it. I had that response myself when I learned about these theories, and I come from a evangelical tradition in which, and when I would open my NIV study Bible, I'm not sure what they look like now, but at the time, if you looked at, who wrote Genesis, who wrote Exodus, it would say Moses. So I was very much steeped in that kind of traditional thinking about composition. And it was only when I got to college, and actually just before, maybe like late high school, when I read Friedman's work, that this other view was presented, and that was a bit of a shock. And I understand that, and I felt a version of that myself. I was also really interested in like the apologetics work of, say, like Josh McDowell, and I remember in the evidence that demands a verdict, there's a whole section on the documentary hypothesis and sort of an attempt to refute it. All that's just to say, I get that very much. Personally, I don't feel like there's any need for concern ultimately in what matters about this, right? I mean, if you hold the Bible to be inspired, there are very sophisticated ways that you can understand inspiration that doesn't necessarily have to, work from the notion that like one person wrote every book, etc. You can have a notion that this book can still be inspired, but maybe its inspiration process worked through multiple hands across a long period of time. So I think that if people feel threatened by the notion that that this compositional story is the case, I think that it's very possible for people theologically to integrate this insight in a way that doesn't need to fundamentally rock the boat.
Mm,
I think it's worth mentioning too that especially if you put a lot of stake into what the Bible itself says. It's noteworthy that the Bible itself never says that one person wrote these works. It became part of the later kind of church tradition that they were assigned to different folks. I mean, it may be the one exception to that is in the Gospels. I think it's in the book of Matthew. Jesus says at one point, well, Moses said this, and he's referring back to, the Pentateuch and this sort of thing. There are ways in which people will have to kind of grapple with, well, how do we interpret that? Do we, the books of Moses were what these were called. And so to say Moses says was just sort of the colloquial way that you referred to this. There's all sort of interesting theological angles you can go down if you want to preserve certain kinds of ideas in a new light in these kinds of ways of thinking. Maybe Jesus, for example, when he said, Moses said this, it was sort of a condescension to what, the people of his time would have been working with as their understanding. He wasn't about to drop the documentary hypothesis on them in the Sermon on the Mount, right? So there's all sorts of ways you can deal with it. But ultimately, yeah, many very sophisticated theologians and scholars do integrate these insights in a way that doesn't necessarily challenge their faith or change the deep mechanics of how any of that works. It's just sort of a shift in perspective. So I welcome people to integrate these insights, and when you dig into the evidence for these kinds of things, then it's sort of like it's not, how would I say, it's not totally just a matter of, do I want to do this or not? There's sort of like there's an argument there that like this is some data and it should be sort of integrated, and how that you then kind of navigate the theological implications is sort of more of like the secondary move based on what does this evidence say and where does that lead. So anyway, that would be a one answer to that question. Yeah.
Gotcha. Before we move on, real quick from this point, I wonder, do you know of any sources that people or scholars that people could access that provide theological reflections on the documentary hypothesis that incorporate inspiration, maybe sola scriptura, even things like that?
That's a great question. I don't know, nothing off the top of my head. I mean, most of the time, if you're working or if you're reading some major, theologians or biblical scholars, I mean, like even who some might classify as conservative, let's say N.T. Wright. I don't think that N.T. Wright is going to necessarily reject the documentary hypothesis or versions of source criticism in this way. And so I guess I would say I can't think of a specific work that tackles this from that perspective. But if you're reading that kind of scholarship or you're reading, theologians like that, they'll have already done that, and so it's not necessarily a kind of problematic move for them to make. But that's a good question, so I'll look into that because I'd be interested myself to see. I wouldn't be surprised at all if there's a whole book you can get on this. But yeah, so yeah, that's all I can say to that.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, for Christians who haven't read your article, for anyone interested in the scriptures that haven't read your article, you're published in the, what was the article published in?
Vetus Testamentum.
Okay, gotcha. Yep. The that academic journal. What question are you trying to answer about the Pentateuch, and why do you think that applying these sort of uh, scores related to how complicated the thinking is of the text and its authors? Why do you think that matters?
Yeah, good question. Well, a couple things. One is one interest of mine was to see if there was just if this approach was if it came back as a sort of validation of the theory, um, or not. Right? Would it falsify the theory in some way? Part of why that's interesting and important is because the documentary hypothesis really
Oh, hold on.
emerges in biblical scholarship in like the late 19th century, early 20th. There have been it's been critiqued. There have been various schools that have rejected it. I'll note that the critiques and the rejection don't stem from a move back to sort of single scholarship. Actually, they tend to be more fragmentary approaches, and so there are in European scholarship a lot of scholars who basically say, no, the documentary hypothesis is too simplistic and it doesn't work and this and that. And so, long story short, yeah, the documentary hypothesis itself, at least as it's been traditionally framed, has been strongly questioned and critiqued. And sort of at this point, a lot of that consensus has sort of collapsed. There are neo-documentary
Oh,
scholars. God bless you.
my bad. My
Um,
light fell. Go ahead. Ignore me.
there are these neo-documentary scholars who are basically reformulating some aspects of the theory. Joel Baden, for example, is paramount kind of there. And long story short, yeah, it's sort of like, well, here's a new way of exploring this hypothesis and seeing what you get. So I wanted to see what it found there, and it's held up pretty well. So one of the things this paper does is it gives a statistical analysis as well of these findings and shows that there are statistically significant differences, between the complexity scores of these different texts. It doesn't necessarily show that distinction between J and E, but that's not necessarily a refutation of the fact that those might be different sources. They just are at such a similar complexity level that you can't, on that basis, distinguish them from one another. And so, yeah, what I was interested in is seeing, well, if you apply this lens, does this hold up? So that was one thing. More importantly, though, and I think more interestingly, is it seemed like a really cool way of exploring this concept that I'm really interested in, which is how people's ideas about God change through developmental processes. So a lot of work I also do is in something called faith development theory, which is sort of looking at how individuals think differently about spirituality and God and religion as they move across sort of the developmental lifespan. And I'm so interested in that. Like, I've gone through different phases or stages in my own life and my faith journey, how I think about matters of ultimate concern. And there's a kind of pattern there, it's argued, that you can actually trace. And so I've actually used these same lectical scoring tools to look at individual data as well, and be able to mark how people's ideas about God and religion complexify over time, and that sort of thing. So I'm really interested in that question. And then I thought, well, wouldn't it be really interesting if you could explore that historically, and you could explore that in this context, within the Bible itself. So one thing that the documentary hypothesis has sort of foregrounded is that once you realize that this isn't all just one text told by one person, it's multiple people telling a version of these stories, then you can attend to the specifics of how each of those different sources are telling their part of the story, and see what's different about them, right? And one of the interesting things is that if you look at the way that J and E kind of think about God, and you look at how P and D think about God, they're rather different, right? So in J and E, God is walking in the garden, and he personally closes the door on Noah's Ark. And, it's a very kind of more anthropomorphic God. And commentators have recognized this since as long as the documentary hypothesis has been around, that, J and E are kind of telling stories about God that almost read more like almost Greek mythology. There's kind of more of that going on. Whereas if you look at P and D versions of the same stories, or just other stories that they tell, their conception of God is more transcendent. It's sort of more God's more further away or more distant. So, for example, the J story of the creation, is the whole Adam and Eve story, and all of that. Reads a lot like other ancient Near Eastern sort of cosmologies. Very different, certainly, but more in that register. Whereas if you read P's Genesis story, it's this more transcendent, God speaking things into existence. It's very patterned and orderly. Anyway, so what I'm getting at is that, yeah, these different distinctions, these different views and understandings of God that existed in these different sources actually map pretty well to different faith stage structures. So in Fowler's faith development theory, you've got sort of a more mythic way of thinking that's more anthropological, as sort of stage 3 or late stage 2 into early stage 3. And then that kind of increases towards what he calls the individuative reflective stage. And as this kind of progression moves along, you get kind of more abstract, more figurative or metaphorical language for God showing up, and some of that literalism starts to dissolve into something a bit more transcendent. And that is kind of the pattern that you see in the movement from J and E, which were written earlier, to P and D, which were written later. So it just seems like there's actually a kind of a historical level in the Bible itself, an unfolding of how God is conceived, that you can actually then not just identify in these different sources, but what we were able to do for the first time is actually measure that distinction, right? To be like, oh yeah, these sources are at this complexity level, and these sources are at this complexity level. We can actually make that correlation for the first time in an actual empirical way. I think that's really cool.
No, yeah, that's fair. I do know some people might be listening to this, and I know that some people have talked about this to me when this idea was presented. But I guess I wonder how the um, the development of how complicated one's faith and concepts about God are as time goes on. How does that uh, like not develop into potentially like um pride, where someone can be like, oh, my conceptualization is far more complex than yours, or
Mm.
if someone looks at other religious traditions from different cultures around the world and looks down on them because of their religion. Do
Mm.
you see what I'm kind of getting at there?
Yeah, yeah,
So yeah, what
totally.
what are your thoughts on that?
No, I mean, it's a huge question because, yeah, anytime you get any kind of measure of any kind that you can kind of say there's more of this or less of this, then just being humans, we tend to say, oh, well, this is better and this is worse, and I'm higher and you're lower and all this stuff. So anytime you have anything like a hierarchy or a stage theory, there are always ways in which people are going to abuse those. There's always ways in which every time we have a metric for something, people are going to use it as like a social weapon, right? Oh, what'd you get on on your tests, I got a 98. What'd you get? Oh, an 85, or that everything to, oh, what's your IQ? My IQ is this. And both we can then be prideful and superior about it, or if we're not as high up as someone else, then we are jealous and anxious about it. So that's just kind of human nature. I think it's unfortunate that things are deployed that way. But science, to the degree that we can work with measurements that pertain to humans, is going to have those kinds of measurements available. And then it's kind of up to us whether or not we're going to deal with them in a mature and sophisticated way, or that. I mean, one of the kind of interesting things that has been part of sort of earlier formations of stage theory models is like the recognition, actually, that I'll put it this way, like it's a very not high stage thing to do, to make a big deal out of being a high stage whatever,
Oh
right?
yeah.
So anyone who's like making like this whole kind of game out of what this means is like the very developmental complexification process itself accounts for the fact that like that's not a great way of handling
Mm,
that. So the context there, right, is that like people who don't like these things because there's a hierarchy involved, and like, and then people make these claims about this is better and this is worse, and people don't want to do that. Well, there's an implicit hierarchy in their framing as well, because they're saying it's worse to do that and it's better not to do it. And so this is a kind of classic what's called a performative contradiction. So we're all working with various kinds of ways of thinking about better or worse, and can we measure that or not is a different question. But if we can, I think it is better. I'll put my cards on the table to see it as being better that we don't use models that way. So it's kind of a recursive thing where these things get caught up in themselves. But that all being said, yeah, these models shouldn't be used for that. It'd be an irresponsible way of then taking these sorts of data and saying, oh, well, this, yeah, making those kinds of moves. I think where they are helpful, though, is in doing certain kinds of, in this case, let's say historical work, right? So one of the things that I argue in the paper is that, okay, well, if you've got some folks who are telling stories, maybe from, in a non-literate oral context where they picked up, or maybe they're even storytellers, like bards or something like that. But there's a different context for that way of telling these tales and that sort of thing. And then you look at instead
oh, hold on.
like
You froze for a
P and
second.
D, which come from scribes that have go. Am I back now?
Yeah,
Can you
I
hear me
think you're
now?
good. Uh,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, is the internet connection for you stable? It should be for me.
Yeah, yeah, it looks
Okay.
good on my end. I haven't used this platform though before, so maybe it's due to the upload rate or whatever. So yeah, just let me know
Oh,
if I freeze
gotcha.
again. But yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Um, anyway, yeah, I forget what I was saying. Other than the historical ways that these data are elucidating, right? So if you look at the different contexts that these stories are thought to come from, one is sort of a scribal milieu in which people have had years of formal schooling and all of that, which took a lot even back in the ancient Near East in terms of what it meant to learn to read and write. This is a whole kind of trajectory. And then you compare that to the other contexts where there's oral storytelling going on. Well, then you can actually use that as a indicator for situating where this text came from, because and this is the work of Polak that I was drawing on also in this paper, that you can kind of tell sociolinguistically, or make an argument for, at the very least, where a text comes from, who likely wrote it, based on the kinds of language it uses, and all of that. And so in this case, you can actually do new kinds of source criticism by having this measure and then trying to place it in terms of where would this most likely have come from historically. And so it does helpful kind of historical work. So that's why it's of value, and just sort of saying, well, we're not going to ask this question because maybe it raises complicated questions around, or some, I don't know, getting into cognitive development of ancient writers is, not something we want to do. Well, then you're closing yourself off to certain kinds of, historical questions and source critical questions. So I think it's a value in that sense too.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, what you kind of touched on this a little bit, but give us like a quick summary. What would you say your study adds that earlier source critical work did not add
Hmm.
to these discussions?
I think it particularly does add this level of psycholinguistic analysis. Um, so a couple of things have happened over the years with source criticism relative to the documentary hypothesis. As I already mentioned, some of that consensus, really collapsed. The work of Frank Pollack really took this in an interesting direction by looking at stylistic, or what's the sort of structural complexity, basically, not semantic complexity, but a stylistic complexity. And he identified these different complexity registers in the Bible. One he calls the lean, the voiced, lean, brisk style, and that's sort of this kind of early, the patriarchal narratives and the oral storytelling style. And then there's this intricate, elaborated style, which you see in these kind of priestly and scribal contexts, and they have different levels of complexity to them at just the level of how many like you count the number of words that are related to a particular verb, or how many independent or clauses does this text have, this sort of thing. So you can actually do like quantitative analysis on the sort of stylistic complexity just at the level of like words and the grammatical structures being used. Well, what this study does is it goes the next step. It actually doesn't just look at that component of it. It actually looks at the meaning structures in those words. Like you can actually study how complex the meaning making is in a different text compared to another. And so that's totally new. No one had ever done that before. And when you're able to do that, you are able to then get a window, in a sense, into the cognitive structures of the people who wrote these texts, which is just, really never before been possible. And I think that adds a lot. Again, it opens up new possibilities for us to then be able to bring to bear some of these cognitive developmental models to ancient writers and look for correlations between their worldview and what we see from those stage models. It also, again, just sort of brings out the kind of sociolinguistic aspect. But yeah, I guess if I were to say if there's one big contribution here, apart from a kind of additional validation of the key insights of some of these source critical thoughts around these different sources, it's a glimpse in a new way into the meaning making structures that these authors were using at the levels of complexity. And yeah, it kind of gives you a glimpse into the mind of an ancient person. It's very cool.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, uh, you have talked about the idea of hierarchical complexity from cognitive science. Um, Simply, how would you explain that concept?
Yeah, simply, what that is imagine a structure, and then I'll relate this to ideas. But if you've got something here and something here, and then maybe this here is let's say squirrel, and this here is dog. All right. Now these are kind of at the same level, um, but you can imagine something that integrates these into a higher order category. So you could have the up here uh, bringing these together, uh, the word animal, right? So you got squirrel, you got dog, but now you have a more abstract category that's animal, that is able to unite or integrate this differentiation at this level into a higher order structure. And then you could do this. You could keep doing this, right? So then, okay, now you've got the word animal. Maybe now there's the word plant, and these are similar levels of abstraction, but referring to different things. And then you could unite those into a higher order structure, like types of life, right? So you can see that we've actually moved into a higher order, increasingly higher orders of abstraction through the integration of different differentiated parts. And when you integrate differentiated parts, you get something that's more complex. In order to think types of life, you have to have first have the idea of animal and plant, and then squirrel and dog, and I don't know, daisy and moss or something like that, right? So what you're doing is you're getting this increasingly kind of hierarchical structure that's emerging by uniting these lower order classes into higher order classes, and then just you keep doing that method, and you keep getting these higher and higher forms of this. Hence, you get hierarchy and complexity, or hierarchical complexity. And the big insight of, yeah, the developmental psychologists, coming out of the Piagetian structural tradition and then advancing really into the neo-Piagetian tradition, was the insight that this is how our minds grow. This is how we learn. This is how we develop in our thinking about things. That you can actually assess that some ideas are, more complex or more developed the more they do this. And so you're able eventually to have very, complex thoughts by means of this process. So if you become, I don't know, a trained expert in the field of economics or something, and you're doing a PhD, and maybe you're able then to, compare, oh, this whole, I don't know, the Viennese, school of economics versus Keynesian economics, and make a higher order synthesis of these two, right? You're doing some very high level kind of academic work at that point. That's very complex. Most of the time we're not doing that kind of a thing. Most of the time we're operating at a more mid-range level. But that's the basic idea, is that you're actually then able to situate kind of any conceptual structure on a continuum of its hierarchical complexity, and get a sense for that, ranging from everything from what I was just talking about, with that high level PhD stuff, all the way down to, there's a cat, there's a dog, whatever, right? Very just kind of representational level. So hopefully that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, that kind of makes sense to me. I at least imagine like a building or architecture, right? You have
Mm-hmm.
to start from some kind of like simple foundation, and then as you continue to build on top, things get more complicated
Yeah.
until you're able to, I don't know, build a store, right?
Yeah.
And that is very complicated because there's all sorts of things that are going on inside a store, even just to make it function. Not to mention the people you need to put in there to make it work, right? So at least
Yep.
that's what I imagine when I imagine hierarchical complexity. And so, yeah, that is understandable. And so you have talked about the different features that you looked at in order to measure this complicating of concepts in the Pentateuch. Um, so, because you talked about their theology, right, and how they're describing God, but also the linguistics and like grammatical structure and stuff. And so, but what I want to know is, how did you avoid, let's say, like simple readings or assumptions in your analysis of these texts?
Well, say a little bit more about that, because there weren't too many assumptions being made, in the sense that there isn't really a reading of the text going on. This scoring is automated. So the way that it works is, there's basically a vast dictionary of terms, of language, of words, and some short phrases that are all indexed to these particular levels. To use your store analogy, imagine making a dictionary, but instead of it just being kind of a horizontal dictionary, it's just a bunch of different words, you've actually vertically organized them so that you're reading the dictionary in terms of how complex these words and phrases are in themselves.
Mm,
Well, if you have a dictionary that's good like that, then what you can do is analyze any text, and you can see what the distribution of those different kinds of words is in a given text. And what's really cool about the work that Dr. Theo Dawson has done is she's basically shown that our language works this way, that you can analyze any kind of linguistic expression in these terms, and there are recurring patterns of these distribution curves in
mm,
those uses. And so in this case, yeah, I didn't really have to do any of my own interpretation of the text or any of that. I took the text as it was, and then I basically scored it. Now there was a lot of work to do that. I had to whittle down the text into the little chunks that I could say that many people had agreed upon represented, this particular source. I had to find the right translation that would be the best one for this. I used Friedman's for various reasons, and so on and so forth. But yeah, it was sort of in that sense not a hermeneutical move I had to make. That doesn't mean that it's purely objective. There are aspects in the way that the translation was done that are going to pick up things that may or may not adequately reflect the original text and the original meanings. Um, there are definitely interpretive moves that are going on in this context, but But the one I wasn't really doing in this context was, yeah, sort of like having to interpret the text necessarily.
Gotcha. And I'm kind of curious now that you brought it up. This wasn't a part of the questions, but you did have to select what English translation you're using, and that different translations are going to register differently, especially when the NLT, for example, is trying to appeal to
Mm-hmm.
people who are reading at whose reading level is lower
Yeah.
than, say, the ESV or
Mm-hmm.
the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version. And
Right.
so, what translation did you use for most of this work, and why pick that one?
Yeah, great question. So I used Richard Elliott Friedman's translation. I used it for a couple of reasons. One, he in making the translation was very sensitive to source critical questions. Um, Now, that on itself isn't necessarily of value. And in fact, it could be a deficit if he was sort of reading things into based on his interpretation of the sources. But primarily, why I found it the best one to use is I think it's just a really good translation. It's very unembellished. There's a lot. There's not really any. How do I want to put, like, yeah, there's not no rhetorical flourishes. There's not any of that. It's I did probably, I don't know how many years of biblical Hebrew myself, but I got proficient enough to be able to read Genesis, and that's
Hmm.
not so. I couldn't help you with anything Hebrew poetry wise, but in terms of reading Genesis, I could do that. So I had enough biblical Hebrew to be able to see what's going on in these different translations and how sort of how much fidelity there is. And I just thought his was really, really good in terms of keeping the grammatical structures, in terms of using pretty simple language to reflect the pretty simple language that's used. So it seemed like the right approach. That all being said, it is important to emphasize that it is a translation, and therefore, yeah, there's going to be some degree of noise that is factored into the scores, the lexical scores, because the lexical scoring is about structure and not specific content. It shouldn't ultimately matter too much. I don't know exactly what the confidence level is there, but maybe there's a variation of 5 points or something, but it's probably not very much. And one of the things I'd like to do is actually do an analysis of different translations, biblical translations, and kind of get a sense of where these different translations land in terms of their complexity. I think that'd be very interesting. Again, I don't think that they're going to be wildly apart. Maybe there's a difference of like 5 to 10 points between the NIV and the NRSV and the ESB. Once you start getting into more intentional paraphrases like the Message or things like that, then you're
Yeah.
probably going to see different things. But again, those aren't really presented as translations per se. They're more intentionally sort of loose. So, but yeah, more research to be done there, because it's interesting to think about the varying degrees of complexity of different translations of the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Um, so across, right, Genesis to Deuteronomy, to summarize your findings, what patterns did you see? Did you see like an upscale, right, as you moved on in the text, or were you using, right, source critical approach? So did you see like um, a consistent increase in the complexity as you move through the sources? How did that work?
Yeah, basically. I mean, so J and E are earlier, probably ninth century to 8th century BCE, where a lot of that text comes from. And J and P, I'm sorry, P and D are later. We don't necessarily know exactly when. There's particularly some debates around when P was written. Some people put it before the Babylonian captivity, some people put it after or during. So there's some debate there, but definitely later. And so if we take those as like two, different kinds of texts, you got the early kind of more oral folktale version, and then you got the later scribal version. Then yes, there is an increase from the former to the latter. There's an increase in complexity across time as you move from the traditions of the oral stories into a more developed scribal bureaucracy in the seventh and eighth, or I'm sorry, seventh and sixth centuries, particularly BC. So that all tracks actually with what you would expect to find if you're looking at the increase of social complexity over time and the emergence of these kinds of scribal forms and that kind of thing. So that was kind of the general trends. And these sources again were written at different times in different contexts, and the verbal complexity matches sort of the general social trend of complexification. Now, there is some interesting debate, though, I think that you could explore where we don't necessarily know where when P was written. So the basic increase is from E is the least complex to then J is slightly more complex, and then P is sizably more complex, and D is somewhat more complex than P. So kind of E, J, P, D. And whether or not depending on whether or not you put P before or after the composition of D, it's an interesting question why you might want to necessarily see one as being less complex than the other. If P came before D, then maybe that's part of the complexification process going on more broadly in culture. If it came after P and actually occurred, maybe during the Babylonian exile, maybe there's a loss of social complexity that manifests as. Probably, you really can't get into the nitty gritty at that level. We're really talking about like the difference of 10 lexical score points. So, how much you want to read into that, probably you shouldn't do too much, but generally speaking, that's the trajectory.
Gotcha. So your article suggests that more abstract forms of thinking tend to appear in certain biblical texts and not others. What do you think that means for how theology develops within Scripture itself?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the questions I find most interesting. It's like, what does this all mean? And here people can interpret it differently. So there are a couple of options that people can work with. And I guess I'll present a couple and I'll present my own. But for a long time, there have been understandings that God isn't expressed the same way throughout the Bible. And so you can work within pretty
Oh, hold
traditional
on.
exegetical, or I should say hermeneutic. Oh, can you hear me?
There you go. Yeah, it's coming
I
back now.
realize one of the problems is that there's a raging snowstorm happening here right now, and so that's
That explains
probably,
it.
yeah, that big.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a nor'easter, but that big thing that's moving across the U.S. is hitting us pretty hard right now. In fact, the entire window is pretty much whited out. So
Oh wow.
yeah, it's pretty wild.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
sorry about that.
I'll let you know if anything keeps
Okay.
happening. So yeah.
So yeah, just to answer that question, there are more traditional theological approaches that I think it was a Calvinist notion of what was called condescension, right? There was this idea that God sort of condescended to people in different
Yeah.
ways at different times in
Divine
order to,
accommodation as well.
yeah, accommodation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting interpretation. Let's say, the complexity by which people are thinking about God and expressing theological ideas, is a historical reality that God needed to accommodate to in terms of revelatory history. So that's one set of interpretive strategies. And then you could actually use this data to say, hey, we can actually map that to some degree. And actually, I've also done studies since this paper into the New Testament as well. Did some scoring of the book of Matthew and the book of John, and actually that fills in more of the story, because if you look from the Old to New Testament, there's a general trend of complexification across that. Paul's letters are very high in complexity, around 1130. He's doing pretty kind of metasystematic theology, really. The book of Ezekiel actually is interestingly complex. Anyway, I could go into some of the details, but the point is there is a general complexification trend across the Bible. And I think if you just read it, you kind of feel that as well. and now this can kind of quantify that. So into the same way that you move from one testament to another, things have changed. There's been some transformation, and whether you want to take a covenantal theological take there or dispensationalist or whatever, there's clearly some transformation of people thinking about God in new ways as you move from Old and New Testaments, and that's reflected in the complexity levels. So that's kind of a more traditional take. My own personal preference, which is a bit more well, I don't know, I don't want to say radical, but it's not necessarily so much in that mold. I'm really interested in how um, in more process theological frameworks, which would actually look to the ways that God himself has changed and evolved, right? So
Mm.
one view you could have is that God's always been the same, and people have just understood him differently. In this case, you could say in more complex ways over time. Another way of thinking about it is that God himself has been undergoing transformation over time, and there are a lot of other kinds of theological traditions that take that approach. And I already mentioned the kind of process theology view. There's an open and relational theology of the folks like Thomas J. Ord and Chad Ball and Tripp Fuller and people like that. And other thinking, like integral theology and other kinds of ways that actually would see God as unfolding through time in new ways. And so I'm really intrigued by the prospect of reading some of this as, what if it's not just people's ideas about God that have been complexifying? It's sort of God himself has been developing, right? There's almost kind of a Hegelian idea, right? Of like the spirit or Geist is working its way, what would you say? Working out itself through time and history, something like that.
Mhm.
I find that a very beautiful idea, and it seems to track very well with the notion of these different ideas about God as they unfold across the history as we see it in the Bible, but also beyond, right? So God kind of gets rethought in the modern period and gets new shades in the postmodern and now metamodern, I would argue. So I find that theological hermeneutical approach very attractive, but I can understand why a lot of people might not. So it's up to them to sort of make of this information what they will.
Gotcha. And that's really interesting because your article really is just saying like, this is the data that I found based on combining these two theories together.
Mm.
How you want to interpret this data is completely up to you, or even if you don't want to do anything with it at all, even.
Totally, yeah. I
Yeah.
think, I mean, and hopefully it's a contribution at multiple levels. I think it would be really cool if people did pick this up to try to inform their theology. But at the very least, I think it contributes to just kind of classic historical critical source criticism. And at the end of the day, yeah, people can choose to just be like, I'm not interested, and ignore it completely. But yeah, so it's how there are different ways to make use of these insights.
Gotcha. So, there's a lot of usefulness to the insights you bring in this article, as you've argued, but what would you say are the limits of your analysis?
Mm.
What does your method not claim to prove? What did you have to do in order to sort of limit yourself in this study?
Yeah.
Perhaps those sorts of things.
Yeah, so there's, like any studies, its limits. Some of them we've already talked about. I try to make clear that we're working with translated texts here, not, this analysis is not done in the original biblical Hebrew text. It's through translation, so that needs to be taken with a grain of salt in terms of what exactly that means. There's so much that we don't know about the meanings that might have been in some of these texts in ancient contexts that now have been lost. So if you're trying to interpret some of this absent some of that, that's an important sort of limitation. I always stress that lectical scoring itself is just one measure, right? It's not the be all end all of everything, right? So
Mm,
something could be more complex, but that doesn't mean it's more true. It doesn't mean it's morally better. You can
mm,
have you know yeah, you could measure the lectical complexity of some horrific texts, and maybe they'd score higher than biblical ones, but that doesn't mean that they're more true. So I think all of it needs to be contextualized. It's really just asking a specific kind of research question, around the linguistic complex, or how would I say, the semantic complexity in these texts. And you also don't want to overread that. I mean, for example, maybe the person who told the stories that we call J and E maybe they were a scribe, who had the cognitive, complexity to do what J and D were also doing and just didn't. Right. One of the interesting things about
Mm,
cognitive complexity is like I can say things like "there is the rabbit," "there is the horse," "it is snowing," things like that. That would just at their complexity level be very simple. But that doesn't mean that I'm not capable of higher degrees of
mm,
complex thought. So we should keep that in mind. There's a lot of inferences that go on in terms of how to interpret what these data are really saying. Um, and then, of course, there's so much that isn't captured by this measure. I mean, I mentioned I scored. It was actually the Sermon on the Mount uh, as well, and it's amazing how the real meaning of a text isn't necessarily in just like the words that you're using. It's what those words are conveying and the bigger principle. And that's actually sometimes eludes this kind of scoring approach.
mm.
So if you just tell the story of the Good Samaritan, it's actually a pretty simple story, right? But it's the context, it's knowing why Samaritans, hated the Jews and vice versa, that infuses it with,
Yeah.
moral significance. And it is the broader message or moral of the story that's really the takeaway. But you could basically just say, that this guy did this and this guy did this and then he did this, and at the level the kind of semantic complexity, it can be rather simple, but the insight is very profound, and that's really the art of Jesus's parables in many ways, right? So there's a lot of that needs to be borne in mind. I don't know, that's some examples, but yeah, I always try to just emphasize this is just one approach, and needs to be always kind of contextualized.
Gotcha. For one clarifying question, for people who didn't read the article in this academic journal, you are you focusing on the Pentateuch, or are you doing the entirety of the Hebrew Bible?
Good question. Yeah. So this article is just about the Pentateuch.
Okay.
But in my broader work, I'm actually doing this kind of analysis in other parts of the Bible. I'm actually working on a very broad analysis of texts across human history, and actually
Mm,
even going into, transcribed stories that ethnographers and anthropologists have taken of hunter-gatherer societies and things like that. So kind of covering a broad
okay.
swath of different, levels of social complexity and that sort of thing and time, because I'm really interested in the question of, yeah, how cognition relates to culture and in different times and different places, what all that
Oh, it happened.
means. And for the first in a way we never had before. Am I back? Can you hear
Okay,
me?
you're worried. It's starting to catch up now. Yeah. Uh,
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, there are things that are kind of new ways of asking these kinds of questions. And as part of that analysis, I've also, yeah, scored a little bit in Isaiah and Ezekiel and some of the Gospels and Paul's letters. And I'd like to do more of that, but we're kind of building in that picture right now.
gotcha. I would also be interested in like scoring particular traditions, I guess, because even throughout all of the sources, there are teachings that stay consistent even if they get developed.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of biblical scholars have talked about the prophetic critique, right, and how
Mm-hmm.
the prophets are critiquing society,
Mm-hmm.
Jew and Gentile, for not taking care of those who are oppressed and marginalized in society, and that
Mm-hmm.
gets repeated over and over again. But it'd be interesting to see, does that get any more or less complex? Does that critique get any more or less complex
Right.
as you move along in the Hebrew Bible and maybe even into the New Testament?
Yeah, it's a great question, and those are exactly the sorts of questions that this kind of research opens up. I mean, I would intuitively say yes, though I don't have the data on that yet. But one of the things this allows you to do is these kinds of things. It's like, all right, here's a thematic vector. Let's explore it in terms of how it complexifies. And yeah, I think that would be a really cool study to do. Is basically score, the entire biblical prophetic text canon, and then see which aspects are more or less complex, and try to relate that to its history and all that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. So, a final question or two. Uh, why do you think this kind of research can be helpful for Christians who want to read the Bible seriously and
Mm.
faithfully today?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there's a lot of different things that it offers, and it depends on, um, I guess, what any particular given Christian might themselves be interested in. Uh, I got into biblical studies as a Christian because I wanted to know more about the history and where these texts came from and all of that. So there'll be Christians like that who just want to know more information about these texts and be able to fill in a more rich account of all of that. And then, of course, there'll be Christians who are interested in the theological aspects of what some of these findings point to. We've already talked about some of that. Um, I think for me personally, one of the big questions that really hit me as I was deepening my understanding of the biblical scriptures was the challenge posed by the differences of how God is presented. And there are more or less sophisticated ways of both talking about that and understanding that, I think. But just personally, it was weird to me, when I would read some of the ancient sort of Mosaic law, and I'd be like, oh, this is odd, like why did God want this to be a thing? And I struggled with that, and then one of the ways theologically that some of that gets handled in Christianity is then you get to Jesus and you get to the Gospels, and it's like, oh, but now there's this new thing, and so that kind of supersedes a lot of this stuff. I think the story is even theologically a lot more nuanced. I mean, even in the book of Matthew, Jesus says, not one jot or tittle will be erased from the law until, so like there are different ways you can even read what Jesus was doing and that sort of thing. But in the kind of Christian theological tradition, a lot of people have just been like, okay, well, but then Jesus, so we can kind of ignore a lot of that stuff. At the same time, there are aspects of even the early Christian theological tradition that have similar components, right? Like you read the book of Revelation and maybe some people are like, ooh, like that doesn't land for me so well. Or, certain things that Paul wrote about that maybe, today we're kind of like, that's a little uncomfortable, or whatnot, right? Like book of Philemon, right? Is this a justification of slavery, or is there any point in the even New Testament where new ideas are offered that challenge what in the Old Testament was sort of as taken for granted? They're really interesting and nuanced theological discussions around these topics, but for me, there were many things that just felt like, oh, that doesn't fit anymore what we know now, and I didn't really know how to make sense of that problem from certain theological perspectives. uh, you know Whereas when I learned to be able to situate these texts in their place, um, that helped a lot. And you can deal with that idea itself in different ways. For some people, that leads into, oh, we should read the entire Bible as very contextually situated, so that what made sense in ancient, Near Eastern context doesn't necessarily make sense today. Maybe it made sense for Solomon to have many wives, but that's not a legitimate, something legitimizing polygamy today. These kinds of moves, right? There's something there, but other people, I think, also want to understand that what's the through line, what's the continuity. Um, and I think that these kinds of developmental angles offer new ways. I think any kind of science or interpretive strategies that can attend to these sets of questions, that can, elucidate the meaning of all of this and the meaning of Scripture for our lives in more helpful ways. I think that this is part of that. And again, as we were just saying a minute ago, people can make sense of this in different ways themselves, and it's up to them. But I think it gives people new tools to be able to make some of those distinctions.
Gotcha. And so, I'm very interested and curious about all of this. But I know that I'm going to be going into ministry, particularly pastoral ministry. But I would be
Mhm.
interested in using these insights, especially if they are very true and valid insights, and especially if I am interested in pastoring in a way that fits with the sort of current cultural mode that we're in, as we
Mm,
talked about in our live stream of metamodern Christianity. And so, with that said, at a very practical level, how might pastors or teachers use these insights
mm.
for their congregants?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I'll mostly just have to leave that to pastors to determine. I mean, there are obviously different traditions, different schools, different modes of interpretation, and this kind of stuff might not be as relevant to all of those different approaches, or it might be more relevant to some versus others, right? I mean, in the kind of evangelical tradition that I was raised in, historical critical approaches to the Bible weren't very relevant to pastors in general. Now, I personally think that was a shame for me. I would have loved to have heard more of that and engaged with more of that. And I think it can actually sometimes be an unfortunate kind of shock for people to encounter some of those things later on. So I think personally, it's really helpful for pastors to introduce to congregants these, at least the knowledge of some of these ways of thinking and these approaches. Um, so just in general, but I think there's always been a tension between what use, or how would I say, there's always been a tension to some degree as some of these methods from the academy have been part of seminary, teaching and that sort of thing. Like, what do pastors and ministers make of that? How do they use it?
Hmm.
Arguably, many people going to church on Sunday are not there to learn about, like what the source history is of these kinds of things. Um,
Right.
and so it's really, I get that. I would just say that, you know if someone is trying to engage pastoral ministry from a particularly kind of meta modern angle, I like to make the argument that these things should be a part of that conversation. But I'm also sensitive to the fact that they're often probably not of particular practical use in many other theological contexts or pastoral contexts. And I get that too. So it's really, again, up to people to use this as they will.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this. I don't have the link to the article. So if you could feel free to give that to me, either the stuff that you sent me or the actual like journal article link itself, that'd be great. So I could put it here in the description. If you guys are interested in reading it, I'll put it in the description. I'll also make sure it's in the pinned comment here. I will go back through this and give timestamps and stuff like that as well. Links will be in description to the social media as well, but feel free to check out Brennan Graham Dempsey on Facebook. He has a metamodern Christianity Facebook group, a Facebook his Facebook profile, of course, and a metamodern spirituality Facebook group as well. You have two of them, right?
Yeah,
Is
I
that
do. Yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So there are two of those. And you can also check me out on various social media platforms. I'll have my link tree in the description. Is there anywhere else you would like to point people to, or make them aware of anything regarding your work?
No, not really. That covers it. I also just want to say this invitation and this opportunity to discuss this. And before we go, real quick, you've been asking me all the questions. Maybe I would just ask you if you have a second. What do you make of all this? How do you feel that, not necessarily how it might be useful to ministry or this or that, but I'm very happy to hear any kind of critiques or feedback, or yeah, I'm curious what your perspective is.
Yeah, I need to do more research into the documentary hypothesis, and that was part of the reason why I asked the question. One, there are going to be Christians who like adamantly reject this, who have very strong feelings about this. So, how would you talk to them? But also, how would you encourage Christians to incorporate this into Christian theology and
Mm,
notions of inspiration and infallibility? Because currently, like I'm uh, sola scriptura,
mhm,
right? So how I would formulate my belief around the Bible is that it is the sole infallible rule of faith, morals, and practice. And I suppose that statement could still be true if the documentary hypothesis is true, and
mm,
especially if we give a theological understanding of development over
mhm,
time.
totally.
Um, Christians have long talked about progressive revelation. Like, we know God
mm,
doesn't say everything all at once. Um, and he's interested in having relationships and revealing himself through those relationships throughout history.
mm,
And um, so I would be interested in integrating all of this if I could say verify the truthfulness of it.
mm,
Um, I definitely have moved away from more from like super conservative views. So I don't
mm,
think Moses wrote the first 5 books. Um, I There are clearly redactors and editors all throughout the text. Like um, I forget his name, but he has a extra biblical books written that are claimed to be written by him.
mm.
But Jeremiah's scribe,
Ah,
right? Like he's
Baruch.
mentioned right, Baruch. Yes, thank you. He's mentioned as writing his many of the texts in Jeremiah.
Mm,
I preached from a passage in Jeremiah for my first ever sermon, and it mentions that basically the first couple of verses all about the community that
mm,
preserved the later text, which is
mm,
the letter that Jeremiah supposedly wrote. And so you'll find all of that. Like in Genesis, obviously there are additional names and place names and stuff
mhm,
that would not have been around at the time. All that, right? So
mhm,
I'm very open to the idea of source criticism as such. I guess it's specifically the documentary hypothesis that I personally have had a hang up over, because I'm also concerned that that creates contradictions in the text.
mhm,
And it's not obvious to me that all of the contradictions that the documentary hypothesis might pose have a
mm.
theological solution
Yep,
to them,
yep.
or a way to understand them theologically
Mhm,
without completely undermining historic Christian faith.
mhm,
So and to be fair, and all of that said, like obviously I think ultimately the Christian faith is dependent on Jesus Christ. And so if he's real, if he rose, right, then I think I would still, and if I believe that, then I would still be Christian.
mhm.
But certainly how I'm Christian in my relationship to the Christian scriptures is going to be different from all that.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's a
No,
very
no.
long-winded answer.
No,
I
it's
hope all
great.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Totally, yeah. And real quick, I would just say, yeah, I mean, there's also ways, of course, in which one can interpret inerrancy and infallibility, let's say, in terms of, let's just say like the Bible could be held as inerrant or infallible regarding issues of salvation, and not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
include like is every place name or date accurate historically, and all these kinds of things. So there are also ways in which you can hold a kind of infallibist frame, but kind of more specifically to like what really matters, and then allow other things to kind of fall outside that and say, well, maybe this or that, or what, you know what I'm saying. So yeah, there are lots of different ways to orient to these questions, but I think what you said makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, one of the great surprises I had is when I looked into the Eastern Orthodox Church of America, and they
Mm,
had some discussion on inerrancy, and they were like, "We believe that there are errors like of inconsequential nature
mm, mm,
in the text, like how many, I don't know, horses Solomon might have had." It's like, oh, okay, and that's and they didn't have a qualifier of like in the later manuscripts, right? This was like,
mm,
if he accidentally made a mistake about this in the original text, we
mm.
don't care, right? And it's like, oh, okay, that's a very ancient and traditional faith making that statement.
Yeah,
Like that's
that's true.
a big deal, you know.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, yeah, that was very interesting. And yeah, one of my content creator friends makes this point as well. This is also something I was thinking about too, right? Like the Pentateuch can be of Moses in that if he's a historical figure, a lot of this derives from him,
Mm,
without it being his hand that wrote everything,
mhm.
or even the majority of it. And I
Yep.
think that could be helpful for people as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, very complicated stuff. I hope it is helpful for people when thinking about their faith and their relationship to these scriptures. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining me, and have a blessed day.